A unit rate is a rate that compares a quantity to 1. When we solve unit rate problems, we can set up a proportion to help us solve for an unknown quantity. Sometimes we solve proportions that contain fractions. These are called complex fractions. Complex fractions are fractions that contain other fractions in the numerator, denominator, or both. The example on your screen is of a complex fraction that consists of 3/4 in the numerator and 1/2 in the denominator. If we need to simplify this fraction, we're going to use our fraction bar here, which we know means to divide. And we are going to divide the two fractions. When we divide fractions, we need to remember our rule, which is to multiply our divisor by the reciprocal of the dividend. Let's look at our first problem. This says Maddie consistently swims 1/4 of a race in 45 seconds. If she continues this pace, how long would it take her to swim a full race? Well, let's start with what we know. We know that the rate that Maddie swims is 1/4 of a race in 45 seconds. So that's going to be our first ratio. And we're going to write it as 1/4 of a race to 45 seconds. So you can see that we have a complex fraction here because we have 1/4 in our numerator. Now the question is asking how long is it going to take her to swim a full race? A full race is one race. So since I have race in my numerator for my first ratio, I'm going to put 1 race in the numerator for my second ratio. What I don't know is how long that's going to take. So I'm going to put a variable to represent that amount. Now, there are 2 ways I can do this. I can notice that if I have 1/4 and I need to get to 1 whole, I know that 1/4 times 4 will give me 1 whole because 4/4 is 1 whole. That means that to get from 45 to x, I can also multiply by 4. If you have trouble with that, you can still make a proportion and cross multiply. So 1/4 times x would be 1/4 x, and then I would put my equal sign, and 1 times 45 would be 45. Then I notice that 1/4 is being multiplied by x, so the inverse of multiplying by 1/4 is dividing by 1/4, which I would need to do on both sides of my equation. Well, these would cancel to leave me with x equals. And on this side of my equation, this looks very strange, but this is a complex fraction that has 1/4 as its denominator. I can rewrite it so that it says 45 divided by 1/4, and that makes it much easier to read. Then I would use my rule for dividing fractions, which is to multiply the divisor by the dividend or the reciprocal of the dividend. So I'm going to multiply 45, because that's my divisor, by the reciprocal of 1/4. And the reciprocal of 1/4 is 4/1. Well, 4/1 is just 4. So I would multiply 45 times 4 and I would get 180. So that means that the answer is 180. This means that it would take Maddie 180 seconds to swim a full race. Next, I see that a car travels 24 miles in ½ hour. At that rate, how many miles will the car travel in 3½ hours? So we see that our rate is 24 miles in ½ hour. So we're going to use that to write our first ratio. 24 miles to ½ hour. Then I am looking for how many miles the car is going to travel in 3½ hours. So I don't know how many miles, so I'm going to put an X to represent that, but I know that it's 3½ hours. I can cross multiply here. So if I multiply 24 times 3½ and we can use our calculators to do this. So 24 times 3½ would give us 84. and then x times 1/2 would give us 1/2 x. Now to get x by itself, I would need to get rid of 1/2. 1/2 is multiplying by x, so the inverse of that is going to be dividing by 1/2 on both sides. Now these would cancel to leave me with x, but over here I have this complex fraction. Well, I can rewrite this as 84 divided by 1/2. Now to solve a division problem with fractions, I multiply my divisor, which is 84, by the reciprocal of the dividend. So 1/2 is my dividend, and its reciprocal is 2/1. Well, 2/1 is the same as just 2. So I'm doing 84 times 2, which gives me 168. So my solution is 168, and this means that the car will travel 168 miles in 3.5 hours. Next, I see that it takes a caterpillar 3/2 minutes to travel 3/4 of a foot. How far can he travel in 1 minute? Well, if it takes 3/2 minutes to travel 3/4 of a foot, then that's the rate. So I'm going to write this as 3/2 minutes to 3/4 of a foot. And you notice that this is a complex fraction that has a fraction in both the numerator and the denominator. Now to make our proportion, we're going to set it equal to another ratio. And we see that we're looking for how far can he travel. So what we don't know is the distance or how many feet he can travel. So since feet is in my denominator over here, I'm going to put a variable for feet in the denominator on my second ratio. And then I can see that I'm looking for how far he can travel in just 1 minute. Since minutes are in my numerator over here, I'm going to put 1 minute in my numerator over here. And now I can solve. So I can cross multiply. 3/2 times x would give me 3/2 x, and then I would make it equal to 1 times 3/4. 1 times 3/4 is just 3/4. Now I can see that x is being multiplied by 3/2, so the inverse of multiplying by 3/2 is dividing by 3/2, which I need to do on both sides of my equation. These will cancel to leave me with x. Now this complex fraction looks very complicated, but it's really not. We can rewrite it as 3/4 divided by 3/2. And now we can solve using our rule for multiplying fractions, which is to multiply our divisor, so 3/4 is our divisor, by the reciprocal of the dividend. The dividend is 3/2, so the reciprocal is 2/3. Then I can just multiply like normal. 3 times 2 gives me 6, and 4 times 3 gives me 12. Now my last step is to look at my fraction and see if it can be simplified. I know that 6 and 12 can both be divided by 6, so it can be simplified, and 6 divided by 6 will be 1, and 12 divided by 6 will be 2. This means that x is equal to 1/2. So to answer my question, the caterpillar can travel 1/2 of a foot in 1 minute. Finally, I see that a dog eats 3/8 cups of dog food per 1/4 of a meal. How many cups does he eat in one meal? Well, my rate is 3/8 of a cup in 1/4 of a meal. So I'm going to write that first, 3/8 of a cup to 1/4 of a meal. Then I'm going to set that equal to my next ratio. Now I see that I'm looking for how many cups. So since I don't know how many cups, I'm going to put an x in my numerator, since cups are in my numerator over here. And I'm looking for how many cups in just one meal. So since meals are in my denominator on this ratio, I'm going to put 1 meal in the denominator for my second ratio. Now I can cross multiply. 3/8 times 1 is 3/8, and I'm going to put my equal sign. X times 1/4 is 1/4 x. Now I'm multiplying by 1/4, so the inverse to get x by itself is dividing by 1/4. And I'm going to do that on both sides of my equation. My 1/4 over here will cancel to leave me with x. But over here, I'm left with this complex fraction. So if I rewrite it, this really says 3/8 divided by 1/4. To solve this, I'm going to use my rule for dividing fractions, which is multiply the divisor, which is 3/8, by the reciprocal of the dividend. So the dividend is 1/4, which means the reciprocal of the dividend is 4/1, or 4. Now I can multiply just like normal, so 3 times 4 would give me 12, and 8 times 1 would give me 8. Finally, I need to simplify this fraction. I can see that both of these numbers are divisible by 4, so I'm going to divide both of these fractions by 4. 12 divided by 4 gives me 3, and 8 divided by 4 gives me 2. So my answer is 3/2. Or if I wanted to make that into a mixed number because this is an improper fraction, I can divide 3 by 2, and 2 will go into 3 one time. 1 times 2 is 2, and when I subtract, I'm left with 1. This would mean that this is a whole number of 1, a numerator of 1, and a denominator of 2. So 3/2 is the same as 1 and 1/2. This means that the dog eats 1 1/2 cups of food per meal.